Hi, welcome to this session on Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. My name is Adam Gleeson. I'm an end-user computing architect and a cybersecurity specialist working for Computer World. So let's dive straight in. So what is Cyber Essentials Plus? The Cyber Essentials scheme has been around for a few years now. It's owned by the NCSC, which is the public face of GCHQ. And it is now run with one sole NCSC partner who acts as the accreditor, and that is the IASME consortium. Why do we need the cyber scheme? Well, cyber attacks come in many shapes and sizes. Some of them are very complex, which have entire teams of threat actors or hackers behind them. And some of them are quite simple with single relatively unskilled individuals, or indeed using an automated botnet that's comprised of a network of compromised computers. Cyber attacks, it's sometimes helpful to think of it as being the digital equivalent of a thief getting into your home through unlocked doors and windows. And the Cyber Essentials scheme is designed to help customers prevent and thwart these automated attacks in their IT environment. Now, it's important to note that Cyber Essentials is not intended to make you completely invulnerable to cyber attack. It's very difficult to do that with any environment. Now, just following on from that point, Cyber Essentials is not going to protect you from the likes of these guys. These are very highly skilled, well-backed nation-state organizations. They're well organized, they're very well funded, and they're very determined. However, the good news is that realistically, most of us do not need to worry about these sorts of organizations. They're looking at embarrassing, very big organizations and stealing information that's very sensitive or would be embarrassing to those organizations. Cyber Essentials, however, is about protecting you from 80% of internet-borne commodity threats. What does that mean? Well, as I sort of mentioned before, your automated botnets is probably the main thrust of what Cyber Essentials is looking to protect you from. These automated botnets will run phishing scams via social engineering, so that's sending emails that look like they're legitimate with links in them that when the user clicks on those links, it will take them to a site and try and download something malicious, or indeed just sort of try and extort information or exploit information from them. Vulnerabilities, so everyone knows that Windows has software updates, and indeed all of the third-party applications that we run also have software updates released for them. Each of those updates, more often than not, is addressing a vulnerability that's been discovered that allows an attacker a degree of control or access that we don't want them to have. And finally, the password guessing, the old username and password that we use, making sure that we can't be attacked with brute force attacks or have our our accounts compromised. There are two levels of Cyber Essentials certification. Cyber Essentials Standard, so sometimes it's just referred to as Cyber Essentials, sometimes it's referred to as Cyber Essentials Standard, and then we have Cyber Essentials Plus, which is a much more in-depth on-site audit. So the need for cybersecurity may seem obvious to some. At the bottom line, we're trying to protect our data. The data is what makes the world go round nowadays. Businesses need their data, they need access to their data, whether that's invoice records or whether that is intellectual property, but they need that data in order for them to continue operating as a business. And by association, if we don't protect our business, then we're all going to end up out of a job. So it's very important to take cybersecurity seriously. Patching is something else that most of us are aware of. However, sometimes I see it over and over again that some organizations take it seriously. Some organizations take it seriously but get it wrong through no fault of their own, just because they're not completely acquainted with the facts. But vulnerabilities are being discovered in software constantly. Now, what I've got on the screen here is this is a weekly email that I get a notification of the different vulnerabilities that have been uncovered each week. Between the 2nd and the 8th of November this year, 677 individual software vulnerabilities were uncovered. That's just in 1 week. Now, this was quite high for one particular week. They typically range between 4 and 500, but this is multiple different software products that are being affected by this, and they're across all kinds of different operating systems: Linux, Unix, you name it, really. Anything that's got software on it potentially has vulnerabilities in it. So what can happen if we don't patch? So before I start, what I'm going to show you is a short video of someone running an actual exploit using the Eternal Blue vulnerability that was discovered in Windows 7. It was actually released by the National Security Agency a few years back. Caused quite a bit of embarrassment for them, but it was also quite a severe vulnerability that featured as part of the WannaCry. That was one of the things that was used there. The definition of hacking is the attempt to exploit a computer system or a private network inside of a computer. Vulnerability is defined as the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of attacked or harmed. In the context of computers, that means that there is a crack in the armor or a chink in the armor of that particular computer. Exploit is the way that you take advantage of that vulnerability. Kali Linux is a Linux-based operating system that was built specifically for the purpose of ethical hacking. However, it can also be used for black hat hacking or malicious hacking as well. And Metasploit is a database of exploits that are built to make exploits easier to use. Rather than having to generate all of the data packets needed to take advantage of a vulnerability, Metasploit will automate and do that for you or for the attacker. So in the video I'm about to show you, this is an attack simulation based upon an attacker having visibility over the network of an unpatched Windows 7 PC. The attacker is going to use the Eternal Blue exploit made famous by the NSA to get command line access onto this computer with system level privileges. Now, what I want to convey here is just how easy it can be to gain control over a computer that has not been patched. Eternal Blue is a critical vulnerability that very quickly gave an attacker a high degree of control, but skillful attackers can take advantage of multiple minor vulnerabilities to exert the same level of control over this. So what we see the attacker doing here, first of all, is running a scanner against the Windows 7 PC that he's going to be looking at. So the point of doing this is to identify whether or not that computer is actually going to be vulnerable to the patch that we want to look at. So the first thing that he's looking at is he's identifying what the actual exploit or the vulnerability is called, the exploit is called, in which case it's categorized this time as SMB MS17_010. So first of all, he's setting the remote host target IP address that he wants to run the scan against. Now, in this case, he's got a Windows 7 PC running in his own virtual environment here, and he's gathering the information there. However, it's really easy to gather IP address information without having access to that. I mean, this guy could have literally just walked up into someone's office and plugged this laptop in via an Ethernet, unsecured Ethernet port, and then started running these sorts of this sort of code against it. So the scan has come back and it's identified that the host is likely vulnerable to this particular exploit. So he's now going to select the exploit that he wants to use. And then once he's going to do that, he's going to start populating the exploit with the information that it needs. So these things are intended as a template, so it won't have information such as the remote host address that you want to use to target it, and it won't have information about the payload, the specific payload that we want to use to run this exploit. And the payload is essentially going to determine what level of or what type of access that we're going to get access to. So here he goes, putting in the remote host ID, and this, or the IP address rather. and he'll now go about setting the payload. So you'll notice that he's also clicking info. So what he's doing here is he's checking that the information that he's adding is being added to the particular exploit that he's now building up. He's also verifying that he's actually building the correct exploit as well. And as you can see, the Metasploit database gives him information about what this actual exploit is and what it's actually going to do. So here we go. He's going to select the payload now. So first of all, he'll show payloads. So these are all the potential payloads that could be used with this exploit. Now, in this case, he wants to get a command prompt on that particular computer. So he's going to use a reverse shell in order to do that over a TCP connection. So in order to do that, what he's going to have to do is he's going to have to stipulate both the remote host, i.e. the computer that he's going to attack, as well as the local host IP address so that a session channel can be established. And here we go, setting the local host, which is his local IP address. And again, more often than not, you would already know this, but he's doing it for the purposes of training. And he's going to be using it over port 53. So once he's verified that this information has all been entered correctly, he's then ready to actually run the exploit. So once he clicks go on this, it's now going to start bombarding that machine with the data packets that are required in order to cause the exploit to work and to cause the service on that machine to fall over or to be placed into an unnatural state that it's not expecting. Once that has happened and once the exploit has been successful, then he can then gain remote access. So in this case, remote code execution. And as you'll see in a moment, it's now going to come up with a command prompt, and he's essentially he has a command prompt on that PC with NT authority system privilege. So it means that he can now go anywhere into that computer. He can create user accounts. He can disable the firewall. If there are domain user account details on there, he can drill down into there, and he can actually find the hashed passwords. Now the passwords are already they're hashed, so they're not in plain text. However, he can then upload those password hashes and have them decrypted using any number of online websites that will do that. And he's then got access to those domain credentials as well. Now, what he's demonstrating here is that he's just creating a folder on the C drive of that Windows 7 PC, and he's then going to go in just to prove that this PC is the one that he's actually going in and doing. So it's very easy to do, and from that stage, he's got access to that example, to that environment. As I said, it's a very basic example, but it illustrates just how easy it is to do if you know what you're doing. Vulnerabilities are also being discovered constantly, and by patching, that eliminates the risks posed by a lot of these known vulnerabilities. So patching is vitally important, even more so now than it ever has been before in the age of ransomware. So moving on to the actual Cyber Essentials standard assessment now, and looking at how Cyber Essentials assesses how secure you actually are. And it does this using 5 key technical controls, as shown on the screen here. So anti-malware, patch management, access control, secure configuration, and firewall. The idea being that if you're doing these basics right, then you're not an easy target for an attacker. So with regards to anti-malware, the idea is to spot and immobilize any viruses before they have a chance to do anything. So we need antivirus installed on all computers, smartphones where possible. iOS tend not to allow this to happen, and again, tablets as well. The anti-malware needs to be updating itself automatically, and it needs to be set to scan on access and perform a daily scan. The anti-malware should also be warning you about any potentially dangerous websites that you go to, but we'll come on to that a little bit later, that some anti-malware may not feature that. Patch management, I think I've probably spent enough time sort of hammering home this point. All operating systems and software must be supported. When operating systems and software are no longer supported, they're not receiving the security updates. Therefore, any subsequent vulnerabilities that get discovered in them are not going to be patched. Access control, so disgruntled staff, malware, or external cyber criminals, we want to make it as hard as possible for them to actually make any system changes. So the first rule is not to be usually working in an administrator account. I think nowadays it's the exception rather than the rule that we will come across people using admin accounts. Certainly in years gone by, then lots of people had local administrator access, but it's fairly few and far between nowadays. It's important that you're also tracking the people in your organization that have administrative privileges, and not only tracking them, but also reviewing them on a regular basis. These are requirements for Cyber Essentials compliance. The admin accounts need to have strong passwords so that they can't be easily brute forced, and users that have the same username and password are absolutely not allowed. Secure configuration. This is the intent of locking any open doors or windows that are not required. So any user accounts that are not used and are no longer required should be closed, or at the very least disabled, before being closed after you've made sure that you've got everything out of them that you need to. Any software that isn't absolutely necessary should be removed. Again, this is around the security vulnerabilities. If you've got software that you don't need there, there's one, it's something else that you've got to patch, but two, if you don't patch it, then there's going to be vulnerabilities in that software, and if it doesn't need to be there, why leave yourself open? Passwords of any user accounts whatsoever need to be using a strong password. Very rarely do I see anyone that isn't using a strong password, and the strong password these days is 8 characters or more. I mean, the shift now really is also to be using sort of really, really long passwords that don't necessarily have special characters, but are made up of a particular phrase that makes it a lot easier for the user to remember. And indeed, not necessarily changing the passwords all the time. Users, one of the things that NCSC found when they were looking into the causes for breaches is that users will write passwords down because they find them hard to remember, because they get password fatigue, because the passwords are being changed constantly. They're not easy to remember. So if you set a really long, really secure password, you don't necessarily need to be changing that, unless you, of course, that you believe it to have been compromised. The use of multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication on administrator accounts is a requirement of Cyber Essentials compliance now. Many organizations have got multiple factor authentication enabled on their user accounts because they're using Office 365. However, the administration accounts have kind of been forgotten about, and the requirement for Cyber Essentials is that it's the admin accounts that are being protected. More's the better if you've got user accounts being protected by MFA as well. Disabling auto-run features. This really harks back to the sort of the days of Windows XP, where you'd put a DVD in the drive and it would automatically fire it up. Most modern Windows operating systems now have auto run disabled by default. Very occasionally I'll come across an organization that has re-enabled it for some bizarre reason, but sometimes, you know, if there's a sufficient business case for it and other measures are in place to ensure that you're not going to be able to plug a USB stick in or run something else that someone's just found in the street and allow it to just run willy-nilly, then we could sort of talk about that. Okay, so the fifth control is firewalls. We need to have protection between your computers and the internet. If that wasn't clear already, let me reiterate it to you. You need to be protecting your computers. You do not want to have your computers just completely exposed to the internet. Now, in addition to hardware firewalls that you would have built into your routers or any main internet connections that you have coming into an office, building, or your home, you need to ensure that you've got software firewalls enabled on all of your devices as well. The password that is set on the firewall needs to be a strong one. This firewall and the interfaces are going to potentially be, well, they are going to be facing the internet. They may even be accessible externally from the internet. You need to ensure that you've got passwords that are not going to be easy for someone to brute force. If they can brute force the password and get through that, they're going to be able to disable your firewall and leave you wide open to attack. Do you know what kind of files are allowed through your firewall? You need to have a documented business case for any ingress or egress rules that you have in place on your firewall. This is not only for your own benefit, but it's for the business's benefit, so there's a record of what changes have been made to the default rule set on the firewall. Do any other organizations have access to your firewall? There's a lot of organizations out there now, a lot of customers out there that have managed firewalls and so on and so forth, and that's absolutely fine. But the organization that's managing your firewall needs to have a secure access mechanism. So that means IP whitelisting, so that the firewall can only be accessed externally from specific IP addresses, and two-factor authentication as well, ideally. So let's talk about the Cyber Essentials process now. So it's an online self-assessment. As I touched upon before, the Cyber Essentials scheme itself is still owned by the NCSC. There is now a single NCSC partner, so this came into effect from March this year. If you were assessed prior to that, you could have been assessed by any one of a dozen different NCSC partners or accreditors. Now there is a single sole accreditor that's applying complete uniformity. So wherever you get certified, whoever certifies you now, that certification body is being accredited by IASME, and they're providing complete oversight and ensuring that we've got nice uniform application of the criteria for Cyber Essentials compliance. Now, part of this is, as well as applying uniform criteria across it, it's also been tightened up, the criteria that you have to adhere to now, mainly to increase the credibility of the Cyber Essentials scheme. Previously, it was a little bit wishy-washy, again, because we had multiple different accreditors. There were lots of different standards being applied. Now there's a single standard applied across the board, and everyone is sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, as it were. I touched upon the assessment being online. Most of the previous Cyber Essentials assessments will have been online. All of them are now done through the IASME portal, and the assessment is to include all devices that are within scope. Usually this means the whole organization. However, in larger organizations that have individual IT departments looking after their infrastructure, then sometimes the Cyber Essentials certification is only being done, the assessment is only done against a specific business unit. The scope of the Cyber Essentials assessment is defined as any device that is internet connected and used to access business data. And it's important to note that email on mobile devices is included in that. And if that's bring your own device, or users repeat using their own devices, you need to have some compliance in place to make sure that those devices are secure, i.e. that they're not being jailbroken, then they're not using old versions of operating systems that are no longer supported, and all of the other stuff that we've talked about already. If you want to, the Cyber Essentials assessment questions are available in advance of purchasing the Cyber Essentials assessment itself. So you can actually get visibility ahead of time of what questions you're actually going to have to answer, and give you an idea of what the sort of the standard is that you're going to have to meet. This slide is intended really to give you a sort of flowchart overview of how the process would normally work. You would receive login details via email, and then via an SMS text message, you'll get your password to log into the IASME portal. You log into the portal, you answer all the questions, you submit them. An assessor, like myself, gets a notification to say that the customer has submitted their answers. I review the assessment. It will either pass or fail. If it passes, you get an email to notify you of that, and you then log into the portal again, and you can download your certificate and a report of any feedback that's been given during the assessment. If you fail, you do the same thing. You log into the portal again, you download the feedback report. This will give you an idea of which areas were not compliant and an idea of what you need to do to make them compliant. You then go through, make those changes to remediate any non-compliances, and resubmit your answers. Again, I will review it once again, and finally you get a pass or a fail. It says here that you would just go to a fail. I like to try and be a little bit understanding, and if there's a slight sort of bit of information missing, or the requirement hasn't been quite met, then I would look to talk about that with you, so that we can see whether that can be addressed or not. So, of all the assessments that I do, there are certain failure points that turn up again and again and again. So what I want to do is try and give you a bit of an insight here, and sort of hopefully give you the inside track, and allow you that if you've got any of these things that are going to cause you a problem, you'll have visibility of that ahead of time. Now, one of the most common ones is the use of operating systems and software that aren't supported anymore. So I've talked earlier about the importance of patching. If the software is not supported, then it's not having security patches released for it. So all of the operating systems on the screen here, with the exception of Windows 10 1903, are all currently unsupported. Server 2012 R2, you'll note, is still supported at the moment. And Windows 10 1903, whilst it's supported at the moment, it's going end of life in December 2020. So if you're running any 1903 devices, you need to be looking at getting them moved over onto one of the newer versions of Windows 10. Mobile device support, again, all operating systems and the software running on them must be supported for you to achieve Cyber Essentials compliance. Any version of Windows Mobile is no longer supported. Microsoft pulled all support for Windows Mobile now. Android operating systems on version 8 or older are similarly unsupported, and the newer versions need to be enabled so that they're running automatic updates, so that they're automatically keeping themselves up to date. On iOS, anything except the most current version of iOS represents an automatic failure. So at the moment, that's 14.02, but this changes depending on as and when Apple release updates for that. Patch management. So one of the reasons that I've sort of talked about patch management so much in this session today is because this is by far the most common reason for failure. Critical and high priority patches must be applied within 14 days of their release. And that's not just on operating systems, that's for third-party software as well. Now, third-party software can represent quite a challenge. In larger environments, the only feasible way of doing it is to have a patch management solution to do it for you. In smaller environments, you can probably get away with setting auto update on most of the software, and then manually keeping an eye on any other software that you have. But if you're not using a patch management solution, then you need to be able to describe and demonstrate what process you are following for compliance of that with regards to patch management, and making sure that the critical and high priority patches are being applied within a timely manner. Admin privileges, I touched upon this earlier. You need to be controlling the use of administration privilege. You need to be reviewing the use of administration privilege, and all of your users should be running on the normal operation. Even your administrators should be running normally using a user account, and then only escalating to admin level access as and when required by system reconfiguration or for software installations. And again, two-factor authentication for administrator accounts is a requirement for Cyber Essentials. The only caveat to this is if you're using a system that doesn't support two-factor authentication, and you'll be asked to give details of that. If you don't give thorough details, like really good explanation of it, I wouldn't be able to assign it a pass. Finally, another common one is that many of the assessments can't be marked because the evidence that's supplied is incomplete or hasn't gone into the detail that's been asked of it. So when you're completing the Cyber Essentials assessment, please make sure that you're reading what the requirement, what the question is, and what information it's asking you to supply. A lot of the time people read the first part and say, does your environment do automatic patching? And they just click yes. Whereas the second part of the question says, please explain how you're doing this. So it doesn't necessarily represent automatic fails, but it means that I can't pass the assessment, and we have to have the remediation loop going around again. So that's Cyber Essentials Plus, Cyber Essentials Standard in a nutshell. And I now want to just give you an overview of Cyber Essentials Plus. So the first thing that's important to note is that Cyber Essentials Plus has to be carried out within 3 months of passing the Cyber Essentials. There's a little bit of wiggle room on this, but by and large, if you've not done Cyber Essentials within 3 months, if it was 6 months, then you're going to have to resubmit a new Cyber Essentials assessment and pay for it again, I'm afraid. Normally, we would do an on-site assessment for Cyber Essentials, so I would turn up at your site, having arranged this all in advance, of course, with a Kali Linux VM that I use for my on-site assessments, and I would run a vulnerability assessment against your internal systems, as well as doing some visual checks with you around your antivirus and doing some testing around email protection, as well as making sure that you've got content control and smart screen enabled on your endpoints. But during COVID-19, for obvious reasons, we now do that remotely. So it represents some challenges, but it's not presented a sufficient challenge that it stops us being able to do the assessment. The Cyber Essentials Plus has 5 main components. We do internal and external vulnerability scanning. We do a malware protection test. We do email-based malware test, and we do a web-based malware test. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these now. The external vulnerability assessment is largely looking at making sure that you've got current ciphers in use, so that you're not using any of the SSL ciphers, which are all extant. And indeed, TLS 1.0 and 1.1 have both been depreciated now as well. So the new standard to be using is TLS 1.2 or 1.3. All of your organization's external interfaces are considered to be within scope. And we will also search for DNS entries that are registered to your company. So it's important that you identify all of the interfaces that are in use. Any interfaces that are present but are no longer in use, we need to see explanations as to why that is, because they still represent external ingress points into your environment. The internal vulnerability assessment, we at Computer World use Nessus Professional from Tenable.io, which is a sort of one of the leading vulnerability assessment tools. And we have to scan or run a vulnerability scan against between 10% and 20% of the endpoints within the scope of your assessment. So if you've got 400 laptops and you've got 100 servers, we would need to scan 40 of the laptops as a minimum and 10 of the servers as a minimum. What we're looking at with the assessments is we're looking for critical and high security patches that have not been applied or have been applied incorrectly. Quite a few organizations, although they're doing their patching, some of the critical and high security patches, when you actually go in and read the knowledge base articles about them, it's not just as simple as install a patch. You have to make registry changes as well sometimes. So often that's another reason for people to get tripped up on that one. The malware protection test, we do a review of anti-malware that you have installed. We verify that the malware engines are being updated frequently, as do we verify that the antivirus definitions are being updated frequently. Email-based malware test is a test of your external malware filtering. So a series of 5 emails get sent. The first and the last email are just test emails that should arrive in your inbox okay. The 3 in the middle have dummy malware payloads, and the malware filtering that you have in place is expected to block those. So by doing this, what we're doing is we're verifying that you've got protection against email-borne malware, so nasty links or nasty attachments. There's a web-based malware test as well. So we use a small piece of software that's been supplied to us by IASME. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're just trying to emulate a user clicking on a link or an application on their desktop that is then going to take them to a malicious website or a potentially malicious website. Most of the time, this kind of content control feature is built into your antivirus solution. However, if your antivirus doesn't have it, it's also built into Windows Defender and it's called Smart Screen. So Windows 10 will have that as well. In the unlikely, or in the event that you fail Cyber Essentials Plus, a free retest is offered. What would happen is a summary report would be created by someone like myself, which would give you an idea of which areas you were non-compliant in, and a guide limit of 30 days is given to allow you to remediate any of those failure points. Once you've done your remediation, we then run a retest, and that focuses solely on the non-compliances, and as I mentioned before, there's no charge for that. Now, the last section before I don't take up any further time of yours today is the actual prices that we have. So the base price that we offer for Cyber Essentials is $295. This is intended for organizations that don't really have any need for assistance with filling in the Cyber Essentials because they understand their IT environment. For organizations that don't have any IT in-house, or they're not terribly IT literate, we offer a Cyber Essentials assisted assessment, whereby the likes of myself or one of our other assessors would work with you to help you to complete the assessment and explain what each of the different areas means. With Cyber Essentials Plus, we have 3 pricing tiers depending on the number of devices in an organization. If you have multiple sites and the devices at these different sites are not addressable from your central data center, then these prices are used as a base guide, but we need to add additional time on depending on the number of sites that you've got, because we're more than likely going to have to run individual assessments to do that assessment. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please contact me at adamg@computerworld.co.uk. Many thanks.